le temps.
Hello, Mr. Foromo. Can you mute yourself, please? Thank you for you all to joining us. We are waiting for one of our speakers. Mr. Johnson, can you confirm if you are in?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. As part of the AU Agenda 2063, silencing the gun by 2020 was adopted by the African Union Head of State during the 50th anniversary of the organization. This vision seeks to achieve the goal of a conflict-free a conflict-free Africa, to make peace a reality for all our people, and to rid the continent of war, civil conflict, human rights violation, humanitarian disaster, and violent conflict, and prevent genocide and all forms of atrocities. In 2016, the peace and security, sorry for this. In 2016, the Peace and Security Council adopted a roadmap for the implementation of this vision. While member states were expected to implement some activities, the roadmap also noted that Peace and Security Council, various organs of the AU and civil society are accepted to play a role in achieving this objective. Civil society organizations then have an immense role to play in achieving the Silencing the Gun campaign. This stance has further been reiterated by Mr. Hamadou Diongue, Acting Secretary of the Peace and Security Council, who stated that civil society organizations contribute toward the promotion of peace and security through engagement with governments. This platform of discussion offers, thanks to a group of students of the Center for Human Rights, is aimed to highlight the need of mainstreaming the AU Silencing the Gun campaign into advocacy work of civil society organizations on the continent. I'm Monique Traoré, a master's student of the Center for Human Rights, and I will be moderating this webinar. For today's discussion, we have 4 panelists who will be talking about the Silencing the Guns campaign and its relevance for civil society organization. The first speaker is Mr. Bryce Sefa, is a governance analyst. The second one is Mr. Jagan Gray Johnson, is program officer at the Open Society Foundation, Africa Regional Office. Then we have Busisiwe Deyi. Busisiwe is from the South African Commission for Gender Equality. And finally, we have Dr. Jafet Begon, is the Africa Regional Advocacy Coordinator of Amnesty International. Thank you once again for joining us. To our participants, you can also be part of this discussion by typing your question in the chat box, and I will relay them to our panelists. Each speaker will have a maximum of 10 minutes to address the respective topics. All participants, you are please asked to mute your mic to avoid distraction from background. Let me welcome the first speaker, who is Mr. Bryce Sefa. He will be addressing us on the following topic: conflict in Africa, its nature, contributing factor, and way forward. Mr. Bryce Sefa, over to you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. As she mentioned already, my name is Bryce Sefa, and I'll be speaking on conflict in Africa, its nature, and the way forward. Now we're looking at conflict in Africa, and our attention should be on contradictions or incompatibilities that arise from differences in interests, ideologies, orientations, perceptions, and tendencies. Here, our emphasis should be, for the purposes of this presentation, on violent conflict, which are manifested through violent actions, causes physical harm to victims, and also characterized by massive human rights abuses, and even sometimes losses of life. Now, the evolving nature of conflict in Africa. Previous times, conflicts in Africa were more conventional, where people stand on one side, meet on a battlefield, and then they fight out. But these days, conflicts have changed to more asymmetric, where different ammunitions, tactics, and other are being deployed to win battles. And there's also an increase in intrastate conflicts in Africa rather than interstate conflicts in Africa. Now, civilian populations are almost always the target now, which was previously not the case. And it's also characterized by massive human rights abuses, including the use of systematic rape and other forms of sexual violence. There's also identity related. Most conflicts in Africa these days are majority identity related, such as ethnic groups, religious groups, clans, as is seen in Somalia and many other countries. There is also the increase in the use of children associated with armed conflict, where the boy child is used as a soldier and then the girl child are also used as sex slaves and to serve other purposes. There is also multiple coexisting agents, which is increases in amorphous armed groups with no or proper chain of command. So you would never know where or how wars are being commanded. And there's also characters who are almost always involved in these wars are always metamorphosizing. So you would realize that you see civilians during the day moving around their daily duties, and then in the night you see the same people holding guns and then fighting wars. It makes it very difficult to know where the sources of the war. There's also more political violence now due to the fight for political power across the continent. And now there's also the introduction of IEDs, where they plant mines and explosives in the ground, you step on it, and then people explode, among other things. And then there's also suicide bombing, as we've been seeing in the Lake Chad basin around Western and Central Africa. And then there's a significant regional and international dimension and implications, including a breach in international instruments, allies joining in with a lot of faces that you cannot know where the fight is. Then there is also terrorism. It wasn't something that was very common in Africa, but these days you would see Al-Shabaab in places like Somalia and Kenya. You see the Boko Haram in Nigeria, Chad, and among others. You see ISIS and then Al-Qaeda also having people who work for them around Africa. So you can tell that today there are more intrastate conflicts rather than interstate conflicts. Hence, the need for different approaches to solving such problems. Now we look at the causes of conflicts in Africa. And then these days, the major ones that always prop up includes unequal distribution of resources. Once a section of the population is getting more resources than the other population, there is always a case of conflict. And then weak or non-existent state institutions. When the state institutions are very weak and do not have the capability of keeping people at bay, there is always the case of conflicts. And then there's a proliferation of arms. When there are always increases in the proliferation of arms, you don't know where these arms are coming from. There's always the cases of people fighting using
sorry, Bright. Mr. Sibangani Dube. Mr. Dube, could you please mute your mic? Hello, Sibangani. Sibangani. Sorry for that, Mr. Sifa. Please continue.
Okay, so I was talking about the proliferation of arms. When you do not know where arms are coming from, there's always a spread of arms, and people pick them up, and then they just join army groups, and then they start wars and others. There's also elections, politics, unconstitutional changes of governments, and overstayism from heads of states and prime ministers, as has been seen in Zimbabwe, and so many other countries where elections has been the main reason for fights and conflicts. There's also the issues of unemployment. Massive unemployment has contributed to conflicts around Africa in so many ways. There's always the saying that the devil finds work for the idle hand. When people do not have much to do and do not have anything to lose, they just join armed groups and then get into conflicts among others. And then there's also the religious extremism and unimaginable demands from extremists. We see Boko Haram demanding more than governments can give. We see Al-Shabaab, among others, also demanding more. Now the way forward. If you look at the Constitutive Act of the African Union, it empowers the African Union in Article 4H and 4J Article 4H and 4J read together calls on AU member states, gives them the power to intervene in situations, example, genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, war crimes, among other things. Again, in 2002, the AU in Durban, South Africa, adopted the AU Peace and Security Council, which is spearheading the peace and security processes in Africa. So the way forward to Africa, the African Peace and Security Architecture, designed by the African Union and the African Governance Architecture to curb such instances. And for emphasis of this presentation, the concentration will be on the African Peace and Security Architecture, APSA. Now, APSA was established to deal with conflict prevention, resolution, and management. And then it comprises of various pillars, structures that provide a comprehensive set of tools for addressing peace and security concerns on the continent. Now, these are the APSA components. At the core of APSA is a Peace and Security Council. Now, the Peace and Security Council is made up of representatives of member states who are elected to serve periodically and to attest to peace and security concerns on the continent. And then there is the Common African Defense and Security Policy, a legal framework that has been promulgated to give a legal mandate to AU for solving peace and security problems in Africa. There is also the African Peace Fund, a monetary fund donated by AU member states and international partners for peace and security issues. There's also the panel of the WISE, which is made up of eminent people representing all the 5 regions of Africa. Now, these panel of the WISE could be presidents, former prime ministers, among other people. We may not know them or what they do, but each and every day, they are all around the continent doing so much on peace and security in Africa. There's also the Continental Early Warning System, which is also known as the AU Situation Room, which provides timely and regular peace and security situation reports and updates for action by the AU Peace and Security. There's also the military staff component, the military staff committee, which is also a military technical experts from AU member states, and military sections. They bring their military expertise to help solving peace and security situations in Africa. Then there is the final one, which is the African Standby Force from all 5 AU regions. It is an operational arm of the APSA, and it is mandated by Article 13 of the 2002 protocol on the
Mr. Bright, are you there? We lost Mr. Bright.
Sorry for the internet. We have
Okay,
some internet situation in this country.
Okay.
I'm trying as much as possible to get on. So in conclusion, the 2020 theme of the year, which is on silencing the guns in Africa, it's not just a theme that was created in a vacuum. It was a well-crafted theme, which does not stand alone. If you look back at 2017, the AU dedicated 2017 to harnessing demographic dividends through investment in the youth of Africa. And in 2018, the AU Sustainable Path to Africa's Transformation. And then in 2019, it dedicated to refugees, returnees, and internally displaced persons towards durable solutions forced displacement in Africa. So if you look at it carefully, you see it's a multifaceted pieces of puzzles put together by the African Union to solve peace and security situation in Africa. And Pillar 6 of Agenda 2063 of the African Union calls for an Africa whose development is people-driven and relying on the potential of African people, especially its women and youth, and caring for children It thus expresses how civil society have a very good role to play in silencing the guns in Africa. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sefa. Thank you for your pertinent intervention. And thank you for highlighting on the nature of conflict in the continent, especially on how African peace and security played great role in reducing conflict in Africa. As Mr. Bright said, silencing the gun needs collaboration of all the stakeholders. Now, we will welcome our second speaker, who is Mr. Jegan Gray Johnson. Mr. Jegan Gray Johnson will be elaborating on the AU silencing the guns, objective challenges and prospects of the implementation. Mr. Johnson, over to you.
Thank you very much, Karen. Dear colleagues, can you hear me, Karen?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. Thank you very much, colleagues, for inviting me to this very timely and interesting webinar on the issues around silencing the guns. I think it goes without saying that today, July the 20th, 2020, 6 months into the timeline that the AU envisaged that conflict will be halted by silencing the guns, we are still faced with conflict. Particularly in ECOWAS, in Mali, 8 years on, the violence in the north still rages on. If this is not mediated urgently, this could unravel to engulf the entire region into rapid destabilization. Algeria to the north, Niger to the east, Burkina Faso and Cote d'Ivoire in the north, and the south, sorry, and the two Guineas, plus the Senegambia region to the west and Mauritania. So in essence, 178 million people are at risk if we do not silence the guns in Mali. In the same vein, in the East African community, if you look at South Sudan's independence, we thought that it would have actually brought peace, but it did not bring peace and did not bring an end to the conflict. Civil war broke out again in 2013, leading to conflict that has displaced some more than 4 million people. And added to this, the country was looted outright by public officials that have left South Sudan technically insolvent and damaged by the ravages of unending conflict. In the ECAS region, if you look at Cameroon, we are witnessing a worsening crisis taking hold, particularly in the northwest and the southwestern part of the country, where more than 2,000 people have been murdered. There are other gnawing issues basically eating away at the country. Boko Haram in the far north, Central African Republic, the spillover to the east. And Cameroon now has the 6th largest displaced population in the world, added to which of the untold misery is the fact that there's a deplorable statistics that show that 1.3 million people obviously need humanitarian assistance, which if you look at it and we put it into context, this is the equivalent to almost the entire populations of most of the AU island states combined, which includes Cape Verde, the Comoros, Sao Tome and Principe, and the Seychelles. In the SADC region, Southern Africa, the unresolved and low-level insurgency of the conflict in Mozambique's Cabo Delgado region is still escalating. The extraordinary Organ Troika, plus the Republic of Mozambique, which met in Harare on the 19th of May, 2020, and there they committed and urged SADC member states to support the government of Mozambique in fighting against terrorists and armed groups in some districts of the Cabo Delgado region. So clearly the signals are being sent that fire may be met with fire. And I think this has been clearly articulated. So clearly, again, it's no wonder that neighbors like Zimbabwe have already placed boots on the ground in that country. And again, the signs are showing that other countries within the region may join in. But again, I think these are just several countries that I just wanted to give an example whose conflicts have a major potential to reverberate across borders and ignite a wider war. As it stands now, there are at least 16 AU member states that are tethering on the brink, with protests, running battles with law enforcement agencies and security services, and heightened political and economic tensions that were ever present, but are now even excavated by the COVID-19 pandemic and the responses that the respective governments choose to take. So again, let me go further and perhaps maybe state the perennial causes that I think undermine our goals of silencing the guns, and proffer some suggestions as to how we can mitigate some of these challenges by way of opportunities that present themselves. So the first thing is, I think, the problem of the term elongation project, which triggered the concept of authoritarian recidivism, which has brought the tremendous disquiet and angst in many African countries and has triggered protests and reduced the exercise of elections of free choice to a zero-sum game. And this has exposed the limitations of electoral and pluralistic participatory democracy, precisely because most elections are largely becoming a predictable affair well before the outcome is even concluded. And the exercise had not necessarily produced inclusive politics. It's also fraught with internal party struggles with other influences, partly civil and military patronage. And you'll see also that the genesis of the problem has more often than not been located within all political parties, whereby major internal democratic deficits remain a glaring feature of their existence. There is ample evidence that shows how political parties operate in total contradiction to pronouncements they make to electorates. So ideas of a transparent, responsive, democratic, effective government is usually being promised by candidates that secured nominations by rigging internal party processes, or promising patronage, or purely through intimidation tactics and even murder in some cases. So that is really the price of political office and contestation, which is largely driven by the potential, again, to access public resources, repurpose it for economic gain and political consolidation, as evidenced in many elections, whether presidential, parliamentary, or even provincial and local government. So what do we do to stem this? My suggestion is that we need to support initiatives that aim to advocate for political party reforms and good internal democratic practice built on inclusivity and deeper forms of accountability. And also we could support the promotion and adoption of the recently adopted guidelines on access to information and elections, for example, and also effective campaigns and consolidation around normative frameworks like the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance. The second issue, again, which undermines the aspiration of silencing the guns, is an unequal society. Inequality and conflict are inextricably linked, we know that. And a considerable amount of research has already been done attempting to understand the links between the two, both vertical, which is between households or individuals, or horizontal inequality between groups, as well as perceived inequality. But we do not need, obviously, scientific data to tell us that when people are deprived through a system that is unjust, corrupt, and non-inclusive, the collision course for conflict is often unavoidable. And what do we do? My suggestion would be that we need to focus our energies to ensure that the implementation of policies elevate the principles of access to basic services, health, education, opportunities for sustainable livelihoods and growth, personal and collective, are all prioritized. And also the ever-resilient scourge of the rampant and unbridled corruption in different forms, whether it's the state capture projects, illicit financial flows, contracting, procurement, transfer pricing, all of these things need to be put a stop to. And there must also be a concerted effort to halt the hemorrhaging of our resources if we are to succeed in silencing the guns. The other issue is the exclusion and social integration and discrimination, which has been a challenge. So, for example, the right to a nationality is still a problem, especially for women in many countries. Through the stroke of a pen, in some instances, you'll see that politicians, with a single agenda of suppressing targeted groups through citizenship laws and exclusionary legislation, will eventually decide who does and does not exist. This is largely related to the persecution, often the total disenfranchisement, and the ability to simply exist on the basis of gender, status, religion, ethnicity, or even political opinion. And we saw this in Cote d'Ivoire in the early 2000s, where the rebels proclaimed that, you give us our citizenship, then we'll put down our guns. So this is a major issue. My suggestion, I think there's need for harmonization of issues of citizenship to unlocking barriers to freedom of movement, freedoms to participate in public affairs, the national discourse, and in essence, the right to express how one wishes to be governed, and also in the process to help to halt gender discrimination. There's also a need for a coherent regional migration regime and a national migration, set of national migration policies and the capacity to be able to deploy these things as a catalyst that could thwart the challenges of free and safe movement within the continent, amongst which are underlined barriers that deal with xenophobic attitudes and the culture of othering and the right to exist, to be counted, and to matter. If people feel that they don't matter, then they have nothing to lose when given a choice between taking up arms or dialogue, especially if they are left with no power to bargain with. The fourth issue, again, towards the barrier of silencing the guns, is the issue of governance and the militarization of politics. The military plays a major role in politics in some of the countries on the continent. So in Zimbabwe, where the military has seamlessly attached itself to politics since independence and recently tightened its grip post the coup and the recent elections, with senior army personalities occupying key cabinet posts. In Sudan, we've seen the military not only hijack the revolution that ousted the dictator, but have now shown a direct influence on the formation of a government of the people. And also in Gambia, although a regional intervention made all the difference, the flirtation now with a base that is steeped in a military culture is being brought back to the fore, to a point where Jammeh, making a way for a possible comeback through an inept and desperate leadership, is now a very real possibility. So what should we focus on in order to thwart this? We must, I think, ensure that the disentanglement between military and political processes is prioritized, and that the Democracy Charter, the AGDEC, simply, I think we need to realize, does not go far enough in ensuring that avenues of gaining power through electoral contestation has to be devoid of military muscle and manipulation. So I think that's important. And now my final point that I wanted to make was really about us, the civil society organizations. I think we need to admit that civil society organizations are on life support, starting from the apex of the bodies, ECOSOC, whose mandate is to enable the African citizenry to fully engage and dialogue on cultural and socio-economic issues for the attainment of inclusive development as an advisory organ. And it was supposed to advise the political leadership on how it can operationalize objectives, principles, and policies of the AU into concrete programs, as well as the evaluation of these programs. It was also supposed to contribute to the promotion of human rights and rule of law, good governance, democratic principles, and gender equality, as well as child rights. Now, I'm not sure if any of these have taken effect. In fact, the precise reason as to the bottleneck this advisory organ for and of CSOs faces is precisely because of legitimacy issues, where membership is not necessarily a representation of a wider CSO constituency, which affects its efficacy and relevance. So we need to reimagine a renewed ECOSOC. Our umbrella CSO platforms as well are even weaker and are incapable of effectively acting as a coordinating mechanism for non-state actors' participation in regional issues. The ability for NGOs and CSOs to effectively advocate around regional issues as an organized collective has been weakening over time. The region's non-state actors, for the most part, have largely focused on national issues and have rarely collaborated to elevate common challenges through the lens of a regional imperative. So some of the reasons for such a concentrated approach to policy engagement are quite obvious. The technically insolvent over-dependency on external funding, a legislative weaponization to constrict civic space by the state, which has led to the ultimate ineffectiveness and dismantling of the umbrella bodies. So for example, IACSOF, SADC NGO, WACSOF have all been severely weakened over the years. And this is also due to the dynamic way in which these organizations are configured. A grouping of national NGOs that are at very different levels as are their states in areas of participatory democracy, and the advancement of citizenry-driven processes, for example, are quite obvious. So, I mean, also the ability to act independently is quite limited. Their legitimacy as to being the representatives of CSOs is often questioned, and their potential to evolve and position themselves to tackle future challenges in the region is stymied. I think they refuse to change in some instances. They have not sufficiently evolved nor expanded their membership, or have embraced the need to promote a culture of leadership renewal. And as a result, we face the current situation of being on life support, which we face today. So what should we do? I mean, I would propose that we consider a massive renewal of these entities and assist them in transitioning from the present state of ineffectiveness to one of reorganization, inclusion, leadership renewal, diversity, and activism. We must reinvent ourselves in order to deal with these issues we are faced with. We must admit to ourselves that we must do more to push the envelope and take full advantage of a new triangulation of actors and triggers, namely the digital natives and the youth activism, technology, and the diaspora. If we can harness these new emerging constituents and consolidate these forces for the greater good of the African citizenry, then I believe that we stand a better chance to survive and thrive and move away from the siege we are currently under, as we aim to bring about the fundamental aspirations of a continent that is at peace with itself and its people. And ultimately, I think we can contribute towards the implementation of Agenda 2063, whose vision of silencing the guns aims to end all wars, civil conflicts, gender-based violence, and preventing genocide on the continent. I think we can, as CSOs, be central in bringing this aspiration about, but we have to be brave enough to recognize that we too must change to meet the challenge. I'll stop there for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson, for elaborating on how lack of democracy and problems related to election affect the effort of AU's aspiration of silencing the guns. It's also important to note that the lack of inclusivity, nature of military arrangement, and corruption affect the implementation of the AU Silencing the Guns campaign. Thank you for speaking not only to the problems, but also to the possible solutions. Thank you so much. Now, we will be having our third speaker, Busisiwe Deyi, who will be elaborating on the importance of having a gender perspective concerning the AU Silencing the Guns campaign. Busisiwe, over to you.
Thank you so much. I think that one of the things that I struggled with in sort of researching and coming with a point of view in line with, you know, sort of critiquing, talking to, unpacking the Silencing the Guns campaign is understanding how gender needs to be understood as a system, right? So perhaps the first question is, why do we need to have a look at the Silencing the Guns campaign from a gender perspective? And I think that Southern Africa, or South Africa, provides a good space for us to look at what happens when a gender perspective is not integrated into the disarmament campaign that follows a conflict situation. What happens is that the guns that have infiltrated a country and have proliferated into a country often then are diverted into the illicit market. And what happens is that people, the violence that those guns produce still continues to perpetuate or still, you know, articulates itself in gendered ways. So I wanted to start by asking why a gender perspective, because oftentimes when we speak about gender in these conversations, the idea is to have an already existing framework of analysis about, you know, the roots of the problem, and then at the end of it, we include women at the end. So women as a category are additive, and they're not the primary or centered individual or group that we then sort of understand as central to creating frameworks and policies around removing, you know, arms or, you know, disarmament campaigns. Part of why gender perspective part of a gender perspective requires us to move away from understanding gender as situated in the individual or collective. So it requires us to move away from the idea that all our disarmament campaigns have to be ready, done, and then we add, oh, we have to consider women. You know, women are always additive. But we must understand, or a gender perspective requires us to understand gender as a structure that distributes life chances. So our first speaker spoke about how even in conflict, the violence that is perpetrated is gendered in particular ways. And we then have to understand that any campaign around disarmament or silencing guns requires that we understand the nature of the violence and how that violence post-conflict then is going to translate into the same gendered ways, and it's going to distribute violence and life chances, you know, in a gendered way. And so this is important for us to understand that gender is not really about adding women, but it's understanding how women and gender non-conforming persons are then put in a space of more violence because of, you know, the patriarchal and systems that, you know, distribute life chances or distribute violence. So how do we translate then a gender perspective into the silencing the guns campaign? I think that what's important is that, you know, doing research for this talk, I understood it to focus, or the intention was to focus on very much centering the sovereignty of countries. So a big part of this campaign was, in terms of the AU, was ensuring the non-interference of foreign entities in providing guns into, you know, conflict-heavy areas. There isn't so much a focus into the internal workings of how then post-conflict do we maintain and do we sustain peace as well, which was important. And this is how a gender perspective allows us to understand that silencing the guns is perhaps the beginning of it, but how do we ensure that of post-silencing, let's say in a perfect world, guns are not coming into the country, but what happens then post-conflict? How do we sustain and ensure that the guns that already existed are in our communities do not then perpetuate, you know, gender-based violence, for instance, or perpetuate conflict internally as well. So South Africa is a good example of this, because you'll see that what has happened is that the guns that infiltrated South Africa, either through the 1970s Cold War period or through the armed struggle where the ANC and other struggle organizations supported armed struggles and were moving arms into the country as part of the country, part of the armed struggle. What has happened is that those guns have moved into the illicit market, and they have, you know, fueled gang violence. They have been fueled gender-based violence, but also they've still fueled you know, ethnic motivated political assassinations, right? And so you see that the criminal justice system and all the systems and structures that are meant to be preventing crime, that are meant to be protecting women from gender-based violence, are ill-equipped because women were not at the center of these provisions, and women were not being centered, or disarmament was not a central consideration in the disarmament campaign. I mean, South Africa is a perfect example. We only had one disarmament campaign called Rollerball, and it was a wholesale failure. But also you found that even the criminal justice system post 1994 was then not taken up and did not create a legitimate space through which people felt that they were protected, for instance. So what you're finding is that all the guns that infiltrated South Africa have moved into illicit markets and are being used to perpetuate various crimes, such as robbery, political assassinations, etc. So perhaps coming back then to what then is required in terms of, you know, having a gendered or a gender centering perspective, is realizing that post silencing the guns, there needs to be robust conversations and also legislative enactments that target reducing the presence of guns that already exist in a country, but also ensuring that you have systems that are uncorruptible, criminal justice systems that are uncorruptible, criminal justice systems that center women and serve victims as well. And part of what civil society needs to make sure is ensuring that the systems that exist are ones that serve people that are gender sensitive, and ones that can be seen as legitimate by the people, so that they do not resort to taking up arms or using violence as a response to crime and the violence that's perpetrated against them. I think any other questions, then I will, in respect to my topic, I will then pick up once we have question and answer, and I will stop there.
Thank you, Busisiwe. You have brought in how the gender aspect is central to the silencing the guns campaign. Thank you so much. Now we will welcome Dr. Japhet Begon, who will be speaking as to the importance and relevance of integrating the silencing the guns campaign into civil society advocacy efforts, needs, and opportunities. Over to you, Dr. Japhet.
Thank you, Carine. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this webinar. Really appreciate it. I think my presentation will really build on the reflections that have already been given by the previous speakers, and especially Jegan, who just focused as the last limb of his discussion on the role of civil society in the silencing the guns campaign. And I want to focus on three particular issues. One, on the enhancing of civil society engagement with the African Peace and Security Architecture, and in particular, the Peace and Security Council. And two, bridging the gap between various civil society actors working on peace and security issues on the continent. And finally, a focus on accountability issues that arise in the context of human rights violations committed in conflict. On the first, Jegan has already mentioned the ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council. That is really the primary entry point for civil society actors to interact and engage with the African Union bodies, and especially the policy organs. But I just also wanted to add that within the Peace and Security Council and the protocol establishing it, it establishes the Peace and Security Council as a platform and a space for civil society engagement. And two particular provisions in the protocol are instructive in this regard. Article 8, sub-article 10 of the protocol provides that the Peace and Security Council may hold open meetings or sessions to which it might invite a range of actors, including civil society. But even more importantly, Article 20 of the protocol establishing the Peace and Security Council provides that the Peace and Security Council shall encourage civil society to participate actively in peace and security matters, including addressing the Peace and Security Council on matters of peace on the continent. These two provisions, when read together, really create the peace and security as an arena, a space, a platform that civil society can use to advance issues around governance, the root causes that the three speakers have spoken about, to bring them on the table of the Peace and Security Council and ensure that appropriate actions are established. But this is only on the normative framework. The reality of civil society engagement, as Jegan has already said, is really far from what the provisions of the protocol provides. We've seen over the years that very few civil society really interact on a regular basis with the Peace and Security Council and the APSA architecture on the broad side of things. And the reason is one, of course, was the restrictive provision that the Peace and Security Council had adopted some years ago, called the Livingstone Formula. The Livingstone Formula provided for the procedure for civil society to interact and engage with the Peace and Security Council. But it provided that civil society that would participate and receive observer status with the Peace and Security Council will be those that have fulfilled the requirement under the ECOSOC statute. And there is a thorny, troubling provision in the statute. It says that only those organizations that have funding of not less than 50% from the membership of the organizations will be allowed to have observer status with ECOSOC. And it's for this reason that many human rights organizations, many civil society actors across the continent do not have observer status and are not members of ECOSOC. This explains the legitimacy deficit that Jegan spoke about concerning ECOSOC. We've seen that it has become literally a moribund organization in terms of representation of civil society across the continent in the policy organs of the AU. But of course, with time, the Peace and Security Council realized that this restrictive provision did not allow for civil society to participate in its activities. So in 2014, the Peace and Security Council decided to amend the Livingstone Formula to allow a more broad, wide range of civil society to participate in its activities. And it came up with what is now known as the Masalu conclusions. This allows now for a wide range of civil society to participate in Peace and Security Council open sessions and other activities. However, in practice, things still remains quite difficult because primarily the Peace and Security Council sends out invitations to a very limited, small number of organizations, not more than 15 that are invited to these events. And more often than not, those that are based in Addis Ababa are able to attend these meetings. The invites are not sent to a broad sector of civil society across the continent. So there is a need actually to look into more civil society engagement in Peace and Security Council. The Peace and Security Council reaching out to a wider cross-section of civil society that are working in conflict zones, that are working on conflict and peace and security issues in their respective countries across the continent. The second issue that I wanted to speak about relates, of course, is interrelated to the first, is that there is a gap that exists among us, the various civil society organizations across the continent. And in particularly, there is a huge gap between the organizations that deal with human rights issues and those that deal with, on the other hand, peace and security issues or humanitarian issues, if you may say so. This gap has seen that we have a range of organizations that are only Banjul focused because they deal with human rights issues and therefore only engage with the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. Then we have the Addis Ababa focused NGOs that are based there or engage mostly there on peace and security issues. And we have, of course, others that are primarily focused in Midrand because of the Pan-African Parliament, and others that are primarily focused in Arusha because of the African Court on Human and People's Rights. We therefore see increasingly a silo approach by civil society organizations on the issues that they address, even if they concern Peace and Security Council, that there is a particular focus on only specific dedicated institutions of the African Union. Yet what the three previous speakers have just told us is that these issues are well intersected. Human rights is really at the core of peace and security, and human rights violations, not only are they the root causes of the conflicts that occur, but also they then are the prevalent features of conflicts. Across the continent, we see whenever there is a conflict, human rights become the first victim. And also, as the previous speakers have said, governance issues, as for instance addressed by the Pan-African Parliament, is at the core of many of the conflicts that we witness on the continent. So there is a need for actors in Midrand, in Arusha, in Banjul, in Addis Ababa, civil society actors working in these areas to join hands and form collaborations, and not just be silo-focused on the particular institutions that they focus on. And this kind of silo approach to advocacy, to engagement, is also evident in how the African Union bodies themselves relate to these issues. So we have seen that whereas there is a recognition that human rights plays a key role in conflict situations, we've seen that the Peace and Security Council rarely engages with the human rights institutions, especially the African Commission or the Children's Committee. Yet, if you go into the protocol establishing the Peace and Security Council, you find Article 19, which says that the Peace and Security Council shall interact and provide a mechanism for a working method to engage with the African Commission and other human rights bodies. It is only in recent years that we have seen the Peace and Security Council operationalizing Article 19 of the protocol to allow the African Commission, the Children's Committee, to be addressing it more regularly rather than in an ad hoc manner. So again, we see this kind of silo approach and this kind of dedicating only a singular focus on only one institution, not just within the civil society, but also within the African Union institutions that focus on this issue. Then finally, I want to speak about what I call an accountability deficit or gap in the Silencing the Guns campaign, and where I think also civil society and other actors should really dedicate more energy and time and put it as a central element of the campaign. And this is the factor of accountability for perpetrators of human rights violations across the continent. We have seen in Chad, in South Sudan, in northeastern Nigeria, in the North Far region of Cameroon, in Libya, in Burundi, across the continent, one common denominator that makes the cycle of violence continue is the lack of accountability for perpetrators of human rights violations in these regions. We have seen that the African Union, the countries that are concerned, really dragging their feet and lacking the political will to ensure that perpetrators are held to account. This common denominator is partly one of the drivers of the conflicts. And that's why we continue to see the cycle of violence, because perpetrators know that they will never be held to account for the violations that they commit in this conflict settings. And we have seen the same, if I may just give an example, the dragging of, for instance, in the establishment of the hybrid court for South Sudan, that is not just in the peace, in the first peace agreement in 2015, but also in the second peace agreement in 2018. The fact that the country had to formulate and negotiate two peace agreements that both focus on justice issue just tells you that the failure to hold perpetrators account returned them back to the conflict theater. And that's why even cessation of conflict has become difficult, because perpetrators know very well that they are rarely going to be held to account. So as actors and advocates of human rights across the continent, there is a need to put more focus on the questions of accountability. Of course, in this, there's always been the question of, does peace comes before justice or justice before peace? But we know that as established in the African Union Peace and Transitional Justice Policy, there is a room that is created, a margin of appreciation that is created for sequencing peace and justice, such that you can, for instance, establish the hybrid court of South Sudan, but only the investigatory and the witness protection arm, and letting that and having the judges and other arms of the government of the court come at a later stage down the line. So there is mechanisms that have been developed for ensuring that there is sequencing of peace and justice on the continent. I think, Carine, I'll stop there and then allow for more.
Thank you, Dr. Jaffet, for highlighting how the legal Sorry for that. Thank you for highlighting how the legal framework can be the obstacle of the effort of civil society organizations in contributing toward the creating conflict-free Africa. As you mentioned, there is a need for the involvement of civil societies organization in peace and security issues. This indicated that all civil societies should make effort to integrate peace effort as they work at the grassroots level. So at this stage, I would like to thank all our panelists. Thank you for giving us a full picture on how can be the role of civil societies organization in the AU Silencing the Guns campaign. Now, I will invite our participants to write their question in the chat box, and I will be reading them to the panelists. Thank you once again. So I have one question here. Beridi is asking, if the effort or progress to silence the guns is being reflecting in budget allocation in Africa, military spending versus other sectors such as health, education, gender equality, inclusive, sexual and reproductive human rights programs, etc. How is the picture looking? So I will hand over to one of our panelists to answer this question.
So perhaps I should begin and sort of note some of the interesting things about the Silencing the Guns campaign is that it has been focused primarily on issues around, establishing sovereignty of African countries, ensuring that there is a clear position by the AU on what they term the interference of foreign governments in, providing arms coming into Africa. So I think that it's important that we question why there hasn't been, an equal focus in understanding structurally how are we then moving and ensuring that we're, focusing on issues that produce conditions of peace. Are we focusing on ensuring that there is greater spending on education initiative, there's greater spending on health and provision of healthcare systems that work? Are we ensuring that there's education opportunities, those public goods that ensure that the basket of goods that ensure survival that ensure that people are able to access opportunity. That opportunity then doesn't sort of filter into the hands of the few that are privileged, and thus causing conflict which often articulates itself along ethical and nationalist lines. I think that it's an important question, and this is the role of civil society to sort of, move against and critique the focus areas that have come out of silencing the guns, that it's not merely stopping the importing of guns into Africa, but rather how is Africa then looking at itself post ensuring disarmament. Let's say we are disarmed today and everybody submits their guns to a legitimate authority, then how are we to ensure that the conditions that produce conflict do not recreate themselves? And I think that is our job as civil society, is to question, are we at a structural and systemic level ensuring that we are moving funds to those basic areas of social goods that ensure that we can say that, we can continue to silence the guns. So silencing the guns is not an event, but is a process that is prolonged and requires funding in various areas. Thanks. I just wanted to say address that particular area of the question.
Thank you, Busisiwe, for addressing this question. I have another question in the chat box. Maria is asking the role of women-led organization in the campaign, and to what extent states are willing to work with civil society's organization, given the shrinking space. So as this question refers to all the areas you have touched, I will ask one panelist to address it, please.
I'm sorry to be, maybe it's what is the role of women-led organizations. So I'm not sure what that question means, because I don't think women-led organizations necessarily means, gender progressive organizations, firstly. So I think that that's an important conversation that we can have. But also I think, I speak from a very relatively privileged position, right? I speak representing an institution that is constitutionally mandated, that is required by Parliament to ensure that we intervene where gender issues have been overlooked. So I cannot, sort of use my position to then, analyze how states are working. We know that the relationship between civil society and state authority in Africa has been an antagonistic one, right? But I don't think it's an African problem. I think whenever you find, authority that is authoritative and sort of nationalist in its character, you will find that the room for dissent and a room for civil interaction does shrink as well. And I think that it's important we take this into consideration as well, because that's part of ensuring gendered perspectives and gender integration into the campaign, is how are we then producing the conditions that ensure that, silencing the guns is a sustained process rather. So I'll just drop it there, and any areas that I have not covered will then be covered, because I speak from a relatively privileged position, and perhaps to just assume that, civil society has a space that it's entitled, constitutionally mandated to occupy, is a privilege that only maybe exists very relatively to my context.
Thank you so much for that.
Maybe I should add, Carine, on the first question that was asked by Barry, on whether efforts or progress to silence the guns have been reflected in budget allocations in Africa. I have no conclusive statistics, but I know one of the organizations that really tracks military expenditure in Africa is the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. And one of their latest studies shows that across the years, military spending accounts for really a substantial portion of the gross domestic product of many African governments, especially in the sub-Saharan Africa, and actually a big proportion or portion of the overall government expenditure. We have seen from 1997 to 2014, expenditure on military spiking. Of course, in many of these countries, the military expenditure is way above expenditure on social goods such as health, education, and social security. In South Sudan, for instance, between 2015 and 2017, when the conflict was at its height, the statistics show that its military expenditure really increased. While of course we know that the socioeconomic status of the country and the delivery of social goods is very poor. And as I've written somewhere else, way back in 2001, the African Union agreed, for instance, to place or allocate 15% of their national annual budgets to health sector. But in many of these countries, we see that military expenditure is way above 15%, but expenditure on health is way below 15%. So you can say from anecdotal evidence and in general pattern that military expenditure is more goes to military expenditure compared to social expenditure.
Thank you so much, Japhet. There is another question. Read it out. It says, accountability is key to addressing the issue of conflict in Africa. Is the AU prepared to ensure that violators are made to account for atrocities committed, especially as it relates to human rights violations during conflicts, to in effect silence to the guns and on the continent?
Maybe I can speak to that. And I think it talks to issues of impunity and also transparency of processes. But more importantly, if we're looking at the trend as to the appetite for political leadership at the apex of the AU, since this is what we're talking about, not necessarily at the state level. Obviously, the state level manifests itself in different ways as to how the AU actually functions. I think we need to, in order to address that question, we have to look at the trend as to how the continent and the region elevates the importance and the prioritization of building institutions and strengthening them. So if we want to talk about stemming impunity and ensuring that justice is applicable and applied for all, access to justice, we need to also apply our minds as to the prioritization that is given towards the vestiges or the institutions of justice. So if we are saying that at this point in time, it is clear to me, and I'm sure if whether Japhet and others would agree, we look at the first salvo that was fired in the regional court, which was the SADC tribunal. The fact that an entire regional body made up of the member states came together and agreed that they were going to dismantle that clearly tells you exactly where the premium or the priority is in advancing, in embracing, in rolling out or deploying a culture of justice at the regional level. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think, certainly in the last 3 years, perhaps 4, but certainly in the last 3 years, there's been an organized assault on the African human rights system by member states themselves. So the virtual attacks that we've been seeing on the African Commission for Human and People's Rights, primarily over the CAL issue, but it wasn't over the CAL issue. The CAL issue was just an excuse and an easy target that they could pick to basically use that to intimidate the commission and basically derail it from deploying its mandate, because there were certain member states that wield a high degree of diplomatic, political, economic power by the name of partly most of the states within the north, Algeria being one of them, Egypt being another, and then obviously in the south, Zimbabwe, because they felt that the number of cases that were being brought against them by their own citizens was, one, embarrassing. Secondly, it was putting them in a corner that they could not get out of, and they were beginning to see the commission as a nuisance. And by virtue of the fact that their own citizens that could not get justice at home were now seeking justice outside of their jurisdictions and out of their national boundaries, and were seemingly not necessarily even getting the justice per se, but getting the attention around the atrocities that were being committed. So the issue around the seriousness of curbing impunity and elevating the rights to justice, access to justice, etc., is highly questionable. It's highly questionable because, given the demonstrations of the political actors that we've been seeing in the last 5 years towards systematically dismantling the institutions and the vestiges of justice for the African continent and for the African citizenry. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson, for addressing this issue. As we are running out of time, I will take the last question in the chat box. It's from Tinashe. Tinashe is from Real Agenda for Youth Transformation Truth. And the question is as follows. How best can we deal with a government that causes violence on its own people, especially when the army shot protesting unnamed civilians? Maybe at this point, I will invite Mr. Bright to answer.
Thank you very much for the question. I think when it comes to accountability with regards to what governments do or what happens in countries, the AU has a line-up series of mechanisms to address such challenges. For instance, there is the African Commission, which stands as a African Commission on Human and People's Rights, which stands as a quasi-judicial body that is mandated to look at such issues and address it accordingly. There is also the African Court, which is made up of eminent people and really ready and able to address such challenges that are presented to the court. So I think these are some of the measures that have been put in place by the African Union to ensure that such matters are addressed accordingly. Thank you. And before my brothers come in, there was one issue that I wanted to talk about, which was the issue of ECOSOC. Can you please lock the door? The issue of ECOSOC came up several times when my brothers and sisters were presenting their I think ECOSOC has been a very, very small office within the African Union, and with very, very limited staff attending to so many issues. And sometimes they may not be up to task when it comes to, I should say, when they will not be able to consider everything that is presented to them at a particular point in time. The AU is undergoing reforms as we speak now. And one of the reform processes ongoing is the movement of the office of ECOSOC to Zambia as a fully fledged organ of the African Union. They started moving just last year, 2019. And the recruiter staff are now moving to Zambia to fully take charge of activities of ECOSOC. So yes, as my brother spelled out earlier, the mandate of it as an advisory body to the assembly is very loud and clear. Maybe, I should say, maybe it has not met what is expected from my colleagues here, but I believe once it's been made a fully fledged organ, being moved to Zambia with staff and everything, some of these concerns will be addressed accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sefa. Thank you so much. Before we conclude, I would like our speakers to say their final words. Maybe you can start by Busisiwe.
Let me start with
Okay.
I think in my present, sorry, can I go on with it if it's okay with you before maybe my brothers may come in? Yeah.
Thank you.
In my presentation, I made it clear that the African Union for some years now rolling out a series of themes for every year, from 2017 on the youth, 2018 on corruption, 2019 on refugees, returnees, among others. And then 2020 has been on silencing the guns. And it is more of a puzzle being put together by the African Union, and it calls for all stakeholders and provided avenues where all civil society can also help in this process in silencing the guns. So it's not a one-man task. It is not a task of only the African Union to silence the guns in Africa. I think civil society organizations have a key role to play. And just like spaces are being opened day in, day out for civil societies to work hand in hand with the African Union, I believe civil societies will help develop Africa and silence the guns accordingly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Sefa. Maybe Dr. Japheth.
Thank you, Carine. I think in my final conclusions, I completely agree with Joseph about the ongoing efforts to strengthen ECOSOC, and especially its relocation from a small department within CEDAW at the African Union headquarters to a fully fledged AU organ based in Lusaka, Zambia. But I think that the problems of ECOSOC are much deeper than just staffing and capacity. I think the problem of ECOSOC goes to the root of its structural design and institutional design in terms of its mandate, in terms of who can be a member, in terms of what are the criteria of who can be a member. So for it to get cure the legitimacy deficit that Jagan spoke about, then ECOSOC really needs to cure those design and institutional structural issues that makes it a very skilled representative organization for civil society. And if a broader range of civil society are able to access ECOSOC, then they will also be able to access the other relevant policy organs, including the Peace and Security Council, for which is really our focus today. I think I'll end there. Thank you, Carine, for this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Japheth. Busisiwe.
Hi, I don't know what happened when you called my name the first time. My mic would not unmute. Apologies for that. So my last words are to say that I want to leave with the idea and an understanding of what we mean when we say a gender perspective is that we're not simply accepting that an existing structure or framework around particular ideas already exists and women merely have to fit into that, right? But it requires an understanding of the structures that perpetuate violence, the gendered nature that creates those structures, but also how then do we invest in dismantling those structures? So it's not merely to re-perpetuate systems that mimic the West. We don't want to be like an America. We don't want to be like the UK. We want to be able to foster those conditions that allow for life-making chances and access to those chances in Africa, right? We want to ensure systems where our education system is properly, our education systems are properly funded, our health systems can deal with crises such as the pandemic, our health systems are strong enough, and that people trust in these systems, right? So I think it's very important that when we question silencing the guns, we're not merely saying no to foreign interventions and more military spending, but also understanding what are we diverting that spending to. If we're saying no spending on military, what are we diverting it to? What systems are we fostering to ensure accountability? And is it the kind of accountability that is sustainable? Are the systems there for us? And do they serve us? And I think that's the role of civil society, is to question, to critique, and to bring a different perspective to this campaign that allows it to continue and sustain peace times as well. We just don't want to stop conflict. We want to sustain peace as well. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Mr. Johnson.
Thanks, Carine, and thanks, colleagues. Maybe I'll just conclude by saying a few things. I think we need to be cognizant of the fact, without being negative, but being realistic, to admit that it's obvious that the guns will not be silent. We also need to be cognizant of the fact and admit to ourselves that largely made up of the fact that, or even more difficult, that the COVID-19 pandemic excavates this particular challenge, because the response is making it even more difficult for us to gain peace in the very short run. The lockdowns have taken away freedoms, fundamental freedoms at the level of the citizenry and everything else across the board. The response has been inadequate. People, I think, have become poorer. There's rising unemployment, more joblessness. Our economies have shrunk. The inequality gap has widened. Obviously, we are seeing now that the resources for the COVID-19 is being stolen with impunity. So corruption is rising. And also there's, again, in this particular toxic environment, we are seeing that there's very little prospects for peace. But again, we need to also look at areas that we have control over. What can we do to make a difference? I think, as I said earlier, there's several things that we could do. One is we need to rethink a recalibration strategy as to how do we reform our civil society? How do we re-energize? How do we re-engage? Because we need to start rethinking of a new emergence, whether we like it or not, of a new African citizen, especially post the COVID phase that we are seeing. And I think obviously what is within our power is the fact that we can use this crisis as an opportunity to look at focusing on our strategies, to reform our structures, to reform our statement of purpose, and also to ensure that we remain relevant to the new challenges that we are seeing, the new emerging constituencies that we are seeing, and ensure to endeavor that we at least reimagine ourselves to recommit to this new reality and basically use all the opportunity that we have, the leverage we have, the technical know-how, the experience, the new ideas, the new thinking in trying to at least address a new Africa, a new African citizen with new approaches to some of the new problems that we're facing. Thank you.
Thank you once again to all our speakers. Thank you to all our participants. Thank you to the organizer, including the Center for Human Rights. We believe that civil societies can make a difference in taking forward the AU Silencing the Guns campaign. Once again, thank you to all of you. This brings our webinar to end. Thank you and have a nice day. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.